At the center of any truly great strategy, we find a pure crystalline core. Now, business schools call this core strategic intent, but it can go by other names: vision, direction, big idea, dream, North Star, Holy Grail, El Dorado. Without this vibrant core of strategic intent, you have no strategy. You have only aimless technique. Perhaps a catchy slogan like, "When the going gets tough, the tough get going." Now, strategic intent animates any great adventure, whether accompanied by practical strategy or not. Now, take the legend of King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, a quasi-myth that began in the 5th or 6th century. Arthurian legend offers us a fabulous example of the hero's quest. The hero's quest is a universal story, and it's the framework for virtually every inspirational and successful utterance of strategic intent. Every great strategy begins with a big idea, a strategic intent. And strategic intent is the articulation of a powerful, achievable, and motivating stretch goal. No strategy can succeed without it. In fact, no plan can be considered a legitimate strategy without a powerful vision or an intent. Historical figures as disparate as King Arthur, Napoleon, Vince Lombardi, Bismarck, Woodrow Wilson, and Martin Luther King have articulated powerful strategic visions. Strategic intent at the core of any plan is a great idea. Without it, you have only a menu of tactical actions. Without strategic intent, strategy is an engine without fuel. Worse, it's a picture of an engine without fuel, which is the unfortunate reality of many so-called strategies. Slogans, procedures, techniques, tactics to give an appearance of strategy, great sound and fury, but nothing at the core. Now, this lecture is about the nexus between strategy and strategic vision. Let's begin with a clear notion of what constitutes strategic intent. And this particular formulation comes to us from business. In a classic work from 1989, two influential scholars coined the term and related their concept of strategic intent in the Harvard Business Review. Gary Hamel and the late C.K. Prahalad have been two of the most influential business thinkers of the last 50 years. And together, they created the concept of core competency in business analysis. Now, in fact, the Wall Street Journal has called Gary Hamel the world's most influential business thinker, and Fortune magazine called him the world's leading expert on business strategy. Now, as with many modern ideas, this idea of strategic intent has been around for a long time, much longer without a name than with. In fact, the timeless universal story of the hero's quest captures the essence of the idea. Prahalad and Hamel gave new form in their treatment of strategic intent. These two thinkers recognized the great flaw in much of our thinking about strategy up until the 1990s. This flaw was the pursuit of imitative techniques as a substitute for strategy. In fact, they called it a strategy of imitation. Now, instead, strategic intent inspires a company or a person or an army or a team with an obsession with winning at every level of the organization. But it's not simply ambition. Strategic intent articulates the long-term vision or aspiration of the company. It means reaching for something beyond your current capabilities and developing resources to accomplish that goal. Current capabilities and resources are just not sufficient. And so this forces you to become more inventive and resourceful in a world where resources are scarce. This is called establishing stretch goals. An older, more traditional view is to tailor your ambition to current capabilities. But this is in reality a formula for just maintaining the status quo. Now, on the other hand, stretch goals without strategic intent are a recipe for failure. The concept of stretch goals linked to strategic intent is one of the secrets to the Japanese economic renaissance in the aftermath of World War II. It entails envisioning a future that seems near impossible and then striving to acquire the capabilities and resources to make that future possible. Numerous Japanese companies adopted versions of this philosophy: Honda, Matsushita, Sony, and Toyota. Now, strategic intent means identifying an extreme gap between resources and our ambitions, and then developing a strategy to fulfill those ambitions. Let's look at a variety of examples of strategic intent. Now, expert mythologist Joseph Campbell identified the hero's journey as the archetypal story that has animated all societies throughout history. Every man and every woman knows this story and is moved by it. The hero's quest is the story of Prometheus stealing fire, of Ulysses' quest for home after the Trojan War, Jason and the Golden Fleece, King Arthur's Knights of the Round Table, and the quest for the Holy Grail, of the real-world stories that captivate, of modern movie heroes, Luke Skywalker. In this adventure, the hero finds the strength within himself to conquer all obstacles, no matter how impossible. It is transformation through triumph. With establishing of your own strategic intent, it's useful to keep in mind the story of the hero's quest. Now, if this sounds grandiose and far from your world, it's not. Your life is filled with heroes and villains, conflict and conquest, failure and triumph. Your story is what you contrive, and the ease of it is that your story elements are all decided for you. Its characters, its impersonal forces, its plot, the villain, the conflict, the climax, and the identity of the hero. You needn't become a scholar of mythology to put Campbell's discovery to work for you. The hero's quest is an epic. When thought out and articulated, it can provide high-toned power and purpose. The hero's quest provides you with the framework. The hero's quest ends with the ship in home port, the knight saving his princess, the union preserved, social justice achieved, the journey brought to successful conclusion. Now, perhaps its biggest advantage is that it resonates with people. The story sounds familiar. It sounds comfortable. Now, if we move from mythology, one of the clearest examples of strategic intent comes from the world of sports. Few men embody the idea of strategic intent as much as the late, great football coach Vince Lombardi. Lombardi was the legendary coach of the NFL's Green Bay Packers, and he won the first 2 Super Bowls in the mid-1960s. His grasp of a strategic intent was sure and unambiguous. He used it well. Winning isn't everything. It's the only thing. This quote may have originated elsewhere, but it has forever been linked to Lombardi. Its corollary is equally powerful and unambiguous. Show me a good loser, and I'll show you a loser. Now, compared to the endlessly qualified rhetoric and ambiguity that permeates modern society, these phrases crash on us as powerful and unsettling. It's their clarity. They lack compromise. They leave no wiggle room, no room for waffling. They leave no escape for excuse mongering. They are unequivocal. Every strategy requires a powerful strategic intent to animate it. Equally, our intent must also be translated into achievable mid-range goals, whether it's our personal strategy or a strategy for an entire organization. Now, to take our Vince Lombardi example, the famous coach did not stop at articulating a powerful intent that could easily stand alone as a catchphrase or a motivational slogan. He did not say, "The game comes down to who wants it more." No, he made the intent tangible for his players. Here's how Lombardi translated the overall goal of winning into a clear statement of strategic intent, making it crystal clear for each of his players. He said this: "You never win a game unless you beat the guy in front of you. The score on the board, it doesn't mean a thing. That's for the fans. You've got to win the war with the man in front of you. You've got to get your man. Now, if we consider a football team as a value chain with victory dependent on each player's individual effort and continuous high performance, it's clear how this notion of strategic intent fits into strategic planning. It's also clear that mere technique can never successfully substitute for strategic intent. An offensive lineman, well, he's not motivated to perfect his blocking technique merely to achieve best practice in the field. A running back does not crash into the line again and again, punishing his body merely in the spirit of total quality management. Does a quarterback give a record-breaking performance under tremendous defensive pressure in some vague search for excellence? No, of course not. Strategic intent imbues an obsession for winning at every level of the organization. Strategic intent backed up by a clearly articulated plan and tactics is key to every winning strategy. Now, two more very famous examples come from two very contrasting arenas. The first is competition between nations, and the second is competition between good and evil. Both are sterling examples of the power of strategic intent coupled with the appropriate tactics. Both examples come from the 1960s, and they were articulated by two of the most influential leaders in American history. The first comes from John F. Kennedy. President Kennedy was faced with a Soviet threat that appeared as a powerful and plausible alternative to the democracies of the West. Soviet technology had beaten the U.S. into space with the first satellite in 1957. It had put the first man into orbit in early 1961, and America's own early effort was feeble by comparison, a 15-minute suborbital flight in May of that year. Now, confronted with this challenge, Kennedy gauged the mood of the nation, and he responded with boldness. He didn't call for imitation of the Soviets. He didn't call for continuous process improvement. Instead, Kennedy issued a brilliant articulation of strategic intent. His statement of intent was clear, concise, bold, and it fired the imagination of a nation.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win.
NASA responded brilliantly with the Saturn V booster and Project Apollo, and a host of new technological advances throughout the 1960s that achieved Kennedy's goal less than 10 years later, on July 20th, 1969, when astronaut Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon. And Kennedy already had a strategy for achieving his strategic vision even before he made the speech. He had already asked his advisor, how can we beat the Russians in space? And scientist Wernher von Braun had already sent a memo arguing that the Soviets would be difficult to beat in the short term, but that the wealthy U.S. could leap ahead to invest in rocket technology the Soviet Union didn't yet have. Kennedy's strategic intent was grand, but it was grounded in a realistic strategy. Now, strategic intent can animate nations to great technological achievements, as we may see again in the space race between China and India. It can also animate people to overturn social injustice, even against overwhelming odds. Martin Luther King exemplifies the melding of a powerful strategic intent and vision with a perfectly executed strategy. He marshaled the forces of an entire nation with a vision of social justice embodied in his dream, and he crafted a strategy whereby every single person could execute this strategy as a significant player. The strategy of nonviolent civil disobedience. Now, this spirit of nonviolence inspired King to fire a generation of men and women in a quest for social justice. In front of 200,000 listeners, King articulated his powerful vision in his famous "I Have a Dream" speech in Washington, D.C. on August 28, 1963, during the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. U.S. Congressional Representative John Lewis, who also spoke that day, said that Martin Luther King had the power, the ability, and the capacity to transform those steps on the Lincoln Memorial into a modern-day pulpit that will forever be recognized. By speaking the way he did, he educated, he inspired, he informed not just the people there, but people throughout America and unborn generations. It was a call for justice, liberation, and equality. Against King stood a phalanx of opposition animated by its own strategic intent. And as we shall see, negative strategic intent can be powerful too, a powerful force for evil. Alabama Governor George Wallace had articulated that intent in his inaugural address in January of that same year of 1963. Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. It was little more than a call for the status quo to keep a portion of the U.S. population in subservient status. This clear articulation of intent was enough to turn many against the segregationists, particularly when their brutal attacks and corrupt legal system were exposed. This was hardly the heady stuff of inspiration. Now, King wrote a groundswell of slowly increasing popular support as the evils of segregation were revealed because of his movement's successful tactics that resulted, ultimately, in the Civil Rights Act of 1964, among other successes. Dr. King did not hail nonviolence as the implementation of a new management technique, nor did he articulate a catchy slogan and then sit back, hoping for something good to happen. He succeeded with clear and powerful strategic intent against a corrupt and racist system equipped with every advantage. Dr. King brought nothing more than his strategic intent and a powerful strategy. It exemplifies what we call these days in business stretch goals, animated by strategic intent. Now let's consider another example from international politics. For 40 years after the end of World War II, the United States engaged in a worldwide competition with its main rival, the Soviet Union. This was called the Cold War, and it began in the period after World War II. It was an ideological struggle between democracy and communism. In the words of Winston Churchill, an iron curtain had descended between East and West. Well, the U.S. pursued a single coherent foreign policy for all of those years, inspired by a core strategic intent. That policy had as its touchstone a strategic intent inspired by American diplomat George Kennan. In the immediate post-war World War II world, the Soviet Union emerged as a threat to the democracies of Western Europe and to the stability of the entire system of states. The Western response, well, it was erratic and reactive, incoherent. It wasn't clear what Soviet intent was or how to respond in a way that could avert nuclear disaster. Until 1946. It was then that diplomat George Kennan sent his famous classified X telegram from the U.S. Embassy inside the Soviet Union, and it was later published in Foreign Affairs magazine. In July of 1947, the telegram was published in Foreign Affairs as "The Sources of Soviet Conduct." And the logic behind the analysis was that the Soviet leadership was impervious to reason, but was highly sensitive to the logic of force. The reasonable extension of this assumption was that the U.S. ought to meet Soviet power with American power. Where actual power was not used, the Soviets should face American will and American resolve. The proper response then of the United States was to contain Soviet expansionist schemes by meeting the Soviet challenge wherever it arose worldwide. At the core of this was the strategic intent of containment, and this became the foundation of American foreign policy for the next 40 years. Containment served as a succinct and clear articulation of U.S. strategic intent. There was no sloganeering to be number one in the field. In fact, the United States was a reluctant leader. But the U.S. eventually triumphed as first Eastern Europe was liberated from communist oppression in 1989, followed by the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. From the earliest 21st century, we have a superb textbook example of the power of strategic intent from India's largest multinational conglomerate under the leadership of a visionary Indian businessman, Ratan Tata. Ratan Tata is the chairman of the Tata Group, and he established a clear strategic intent for his automotive company in 2003. He envisioned a 4-passenger vehicle meeting minimum safety and emission standards that the average Indian could afford. But it was to be much, much more than simply another cheap automobile. Tata articulated a strategic intent that no other person in his company believed possible at the time. He insisted that it was to be the world's cheapest automobile, the people's car, and it would cost no more than 1 lakh, at the time, $2,000. His engineers balked at this, but Tata would not budge, and he insisted on the price and a brutal timetable. They met both. The result was the unveiling of the Tata Nano in early 2008, a tiny, inexpensive 4-passenger automobile designed and built in India, and the end product of an incredible focus and vision of one man, Ratan Tata. Tata said that today we indeed have a people's car which is affordable and yet built to meet safety requirements and emission norms, to be fuel efficient and low on emissions, said Tata at the launch. But the Nano did much more than provide inexpensive transportation for the poorest Indians. Its innovative cost-cutting measures have revolutionized the way automobiles are made and sold, in price, in size, in distribution, and in technology. Cost-cutting engineering secrets include a hollowed-out steering wheel shaft, a trunk with space for a briefcase, and a rear-mounted engine with the power akin to a high-end riding lawnmower. Tata uses lighter steel, uses a smaller engine, and has negotiated longer-term sourcing agreements with parts suppliers. Now, all told, the development of the Nano may have created an entirely new management revolution akin to that of the Japanese Kanban cards, just-in-time processes, and Kaizen, or continuous improvement. In honor of the founder of modern India, you might call it Gandhian engineering, which fuses unconventional ways of thinking with a frugality born of scarcity. One parts supplier characterized it as Tata just throwing out everything the auto industry had thought about cost structures in the past and taking out a clean sheet of paper and asking, what's possible? Now, as they built Tata's new car, the guiding philosophy was this: asking the question, do we really need that? Powerful strategic intent makes such questioning not only permissible, but necessary. Now, we've looked at powerful and successful examples of strategic intent. When strategic intent is absent, however, a company can lose its focus and it can drift. And in a crisis, a company with no strategic intent, well, it can collapse. Let's turn to what happens when, in business, a company refuses to articulate a powerful vision, when it refuses to state its strategic intent. Digital Equipment Corporation is an example of a company that refused to make the hard choices necessary for coherent strategy, and it found itself paralyzed, unable to even articulate a coherent strategic intent. In 1992, the company was faced with the necessity of charting its strategic direction in what was a chaotic electronics industry. The company could not decide on one of 3 directions advocated by passionate adherents within the senior leadership, whether to manufacture chips or to offer customers consulting solutions, or finally to build computers. So the company compromised. The company issued this statement. Digital Equipment Corporation is committed to providing high-quality products and services and being a leader in data processing. Now this statement, this is a pretense. It's like whitewash on a rotting fence. Its vague language and its lack of focus is an indicator of faltering leadership. It was surely not designed to rally the troops at a time of company crisis. 6 years after this debacle, the company was swallowed by Compaq. Now let me issue a caveat here to note that a powerful, focused strategic intent is not sufficient for securing the ends of your strategic plan. Misguided intent can be just as bad as no intent at all. Here, an example from business is the proud company Levi Strauss, makers of possibly the most famous blue jeans in history. Under CEO Bob Haas, who assumed command from 1984 to 1999, Levi's adopted a strategic vision that was nothing short of bizarre, according to some observers. Competitive intelligence expert Ben Jalad contends that Levi's was a classic case of a leader with a vision, but the vision did not match reality, and the leader did not let that obstruct his actions. The management had adopted a vision that seemed to have nothing to do with selling of blue jeans. After a promising turnaround in 1984, Levi's market share then plummeted from 1990 to 2000, from 48% of the market down to 17%. Levi's was busy looking inward to, quote, recreate capitalism in Bob Haas's humanistic image of utopia, according to Ben Jalad. Now, this strategic intent completely forgot about customers. And in 1998, the company delivered its back-to-school line to its leading vendor, JCPenney, 45 days late. The strategic intent had little to do with the purpose of the business. Well, another example on a far greater scale than a single company comes from Imperial Japan in the 1930s. We can look at the grandiose Japanese strategic intent of the late 1930s for a lesson in strategic intent gone awry. Japan wanted to rectify many of the perceived injustices of the colonial period in Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. Imperial Japan envisioned an Asian region free of the Western powers, but under its own leadership. And this region was to be called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Japan's Prime Minister, Fumimaro Konoe, was the architect of this forced would-be economic alliance. This alliance was purported to be a new international order that sought a euphemistic co-prosperity for countries throughout Asia. This, of course, was really a front for Japanese imperialist ambitions, and it led to the establishment of puppet regimes in every place the Japanese were ascendant. But every student of history knows now that Japan overreached. It did not have the capabilities to match its ambitions, and while its strategy worked for a time, in the long run, it was not tenable. And as a final example of a powerful and successful statement of strategic intent, consider this powerful statement by one of America's most revered leaders, Abraham Lincoln. President Lincoln grappled with the greatest trial of any president in American history. He faced the real possibility of the dissolution of the country by bloody civil war. He was forced to wage war against his countrymen. But he did not wage war simply and reactively and as a mere technical process. No, he waged war with strategic intent of maintaining the Union as a country free for all men, breathing life into those ideals put to paper almost a century earlier. These were ideals he so eloquently framed already 2 years before he became president, during his first speech as a candidate for the U.S. Senate in 1858. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently, half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall. But I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. And then, in one of the most powerful expressions of strategic intent ever articulated, the Gettysburg Address, delivered as a eulogy for those who died in battle, begins with these famous words. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And the Gettysburg Address concludes with a ringing statement of strategic intent. We here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. From foreign policy to social policy, to business, to sports, to myth and even legend, to the preservation of the Union, strategic intent provides a powerful impetus to drive cogent strategy and to motivate people to implement that strategy. Strategy without strategic vision is just soulless technique. It's a great flurry of activity akin to that of a treadmill. We see this often, too often, as part of the strategic masquerade. There is nothing courageous about making a bold pronouncement in vague language, sloganeering in the language of market leadership, or hat-tipping to shareholder wealth or to the pursuit of excellence. Lack of strategic intent, this means a loss of focus and the routinization of process. Continuous improvement is neither strategic intent nor a strategy. Being the best I can be is neither a strategic intent nor is it a strategy. We've seen that articulating a strategic intent requires boldness, grounded in a strategic and accurate assessment of reality. It means charting a course and closing off some options because you have elected consciously to pursue one goal with single-minded fervor. With regard to strategic intent in our own lives, too often we perhaps think too modestly. We look only at our resources and we trim our ambitions accordingly. We can't all be Abraham Lincoln or Martin Luther King Jr., but we can, and we should, set seemingly impossible goals, acquire the necessary resources, and develop a strategy to attain those goals.